Hi, I'm Michael Faulkner, pastor of outreach here at Victory Church. I want to invite you to take a moment to listen to EdTalks. It's an important conversation between Pastor Ed and some of today's leaders. But here's the thing, we started these conversations several months ago. These conversations are more important now than ever. Because Pastor Ed not only talks, but he listens. That's an important skill for all of us to develop. I think you'll be challenged, stimulated, and encouraged. Listen to EdTalks.
It's so good to be with you again. I wish we could meet for lunch and just hang out and talk about what's going on, but I appreciate your joining me on this Zoom call and talk about what's going on. And you're in a really unique position because I think, you're a PhD candidate at Temple in the field of criminal justice, right? And you're a professor there as well. You head up some youth type advocacy in Philadelphia and beyond, I know. And you're also, and this is, I'm a little biased, your most important role besides, you're being a husband, but professionally speaking, your most important role is you are a pastor, church planter, and you're doing so alongside your brother, who is a Philadelphia police officer. So you got a lot of different things going on, and your personal life touches on a lot of issues that are confronting our society right now. So how are you feeling? How are you dealing with all this?
I think I'm all over the place. News is coming in left and right. When you wear different hats and different roles, it's really been interesting. So I was on a call, did the series with WHYY recently last week called Police Reimagine, which was awesome. Having conversation with my colleagues in the academic setting. We are actually starting a new Instagram page called What's Just, and trying to do some public criminology, trying to really help the community grapple with some of these really complex issues like defunding the police and what does kind of reimagine the criminal justice system looks like. And then on the faith-based side, it's been really interesting because alongside my brother, we planted the church, and coming up in July, it'll be 5 years. And so we've seen a lot of growth, but kind of having our kind of ear to the streets, dealing with a lot of issues in our particular communities. And we're located right here in the inner city in the Germantown section. And so when things were happening in Philadelphia, we saw the looting that take place. We saw the communities who were hurt by the civil unrest of things that was going on. So it's been really interesting, and I think it's been challenging my brain to speak to a lot of these different issues. And so it's been really interesting to use a framework to kind of help people think about everything that's been going on.
You used the term public criminology, which I haven't heard before. I guess we all have opinions about how to deal with the issues of crime in our society. And right now, with what's been going on with regard to police killings in the African American community, everybody's thinking about criminology right now. What do you see as the big issues? What's your opinion on that? And I can ask you as a professional, as a scholar, what do you really see bottom line foundational issues that we have to deal with?
And it's so interesting that you said you never heard of public criminology, because that's been some of the things that academics we've been trying to do for a while, especially in the criminal justice space, because public criminology is simply having academics who study criminal justice and crime to kind of move outside of the ivory tower and to make some of those really complex concepts really relatable to communities. And so what's really interesting, when we talk about some bottom line issues that people are maybe not familiar with, that criminal justice is actually a made up degree, which kind of sounds a little crazy. Until the 1980s, you couldn't major in criminal justice. It didn't exist. And so if you think about the structure of higher education, right? A university needs chemistry to run, it needs English, it needs biology, but a university can function without criminal justice. So you couldn't get a degree major in criminal justice into the 1980s. And how the degree kind of birthed was you had a movement about a federal government to make police officers more professional. And so they offered federal funds for police officers to go to school. And so they cut those funds, and police officers were outraged and they protested because they wanted to continue studying. And then universities, we were kind of like the bastard discipline, and then we kind of evolved. And so the reason why we don't see as much change as we should see, and I would say the bottom line is for two reasons. One, we're a new discipline. So before criminology came along, sociology was kind of the queen discipline that people ascribe to. So we're still trying to figure a lot of things out. And two, criminal justice is very political. We're probably one of the few fields that the research that comes out and what we study and how we think about crime is directly related to social and political issues. So for example, wherever we're at in our society, if the society is more conservative, there's going to be more conservative views on criminal justice, even if we have evidence-based practice that say we should. And I'll provide an example in a minute, but the society is more liberal, then we shift to more liberal views, even if we have evidence-based evidence-based studies that say we should be doing otherwise. So whatever the pendulum is swinging, that's where we find ourselves. For example, in more conservative times, people have called for the end of a war on drugs. So basically in the 1980s, there was a crack epidemic. And we, at the time, the communities were kind of outraged. And they thought that we would see like very high crime rates because we had this new drug on the streets that, never saw before and was ravaging communities. A lot of criminologists called for that this was more of a public health issue and it wasn't a criminal justice issue. But because a lot of funding got cut for like mental hospitals and social services programs, war on drugs pretty much locked up a bunch of drug users and drug sellers. And basically those people will go to prison. They wouldn't really get any drug treatment. They would come back on the street and we would have this revolving circle. And so, but when things get more liberal, as we see now, and you think about the defund the police movement, it's very difficult to kind of have sound evidence-based judgment because criminologists haven't done public criminology. And so when criminologist says, hold on, wait a minute, you may not want to defund the police or abolish the police without a detailed plan because there can be some unintended consequences. Because we're kind of in the liberal pendulum shift, that's not really what people want to hear. And I will say it's really interesting because myself and other colleagues, we call ourselves prison abolitionists. And that's not to say that we want a world without consequences, but when people talk about abolition, it's not so much in a practical sense, but it's also like a theoretical framework. So we have a system that's not working, these human systems, police and prisons that don't work. So people go to prison, they kind of stay in the long-term storage locker, they come out, they don't get any services and go right back in. We're asking to think about a new system where individuals, when they commit a crime, will have a sense of punishment, could rectify that particular issue and come out as better means of society. But when we were arguing for reimagining prisons, one of the things that we were adamant about was abolishing the death penalty. We thought that was cruel. It was a lot of research that was saying that the death penalty, even though it was one of the harshest sentences that you could have, it wasn't deterring crime and it was very inhumane. And so what we saw was that states less and less relied on the death penalty. It's hardly ever used now, but there was an unintended consequences that when death penalty cases decreased dramatically, we got a rise and call life without parole sentences. And so life without parole sentences, especially in the state of Pennsylvania, means that you'll actually die in prison for the natural life. And some people have called it death by incarceration. And one of the issues of when you get a life without parole sentence instead of a death penalty sentence, when you have a death penalty sentence, the threshold is a little higher if you're innocent to make your appeals and go through the legal process. When you have a life without parole sentence, that standard is diminished. And so you don't get as many appeals, you don't get as many access to defense counsel. So essentially we're still giving people death sentences without the standard if you're innocent. So those are some of the things we kind of talk about and as the bottom line. So I would say one, the bottom line is criminal justice is a new discipline, and two is very connected to social and political times that we currently live in.
Now, do you and your brother see eye to eye on all the police issues and issues of incarceration and prevention of violence, all that?
I think we kind of, for the most part, I think we agree. I think the how is particularly different in how things. So he's a police officer, and also I serve as a police chaplain. And I think what people have to understand, and I've been doing these talks with my colleague, Dr. Abby Henson. She's at Arizona State University. We've been having these critical conversations because a lot of times, a lot of people like to think about these issues as in black and white, and there's a lot of gray area. And so what you have is you have officers, especially when the George Floyd protests and the protests were going around the country, you had officers who were working 12-hour days with no days off every day in very highly stressful environments. So as people was calling for police reform, how could you ask individuals to reform themselves if they're working these high stressed jobs for 12 hours with no days off? And so they haven't had a time to reflect. And so I think people don't understand how difficult the policing job is. But at the same time, we can talk about the difficulty of the job while also having a conversation of changing the police. So I think there's a both and there, and there's a lot of gray area. And I know a lot of people are saying, well, how come we're not changing this and we're not changing this? If you look at the academic literature, people have been calling for police reform for a long time. The problem is this is where it becomes very interesting and tricky with the gray area is community safety, right? So a lot of times, I don't know if I'm not a big political person, but if you watch CNN or if you go back and watch anybody's political campaign from, let's say, 2019 all the way back into maybe the 1940s or 50s, every politician, right? So people are outraged currently because of George Floyd, but every politician who people have voted for says that they're going to get tough on crime. I've never heard a politician that said, I'm Juwan Bennett, I'm running for office, and I'm going to, be soft on crime. So because of this mantra, when people, communities, they want to feel safe and they should feel safe, but when we elect individuals and all of the policies and procedures that have been put in place have been get tough on crime, there's very little room to make interventions. And I think people talk about a powder keg. This moment in time was always eventually going to come. We wasn't sure if it was going to look like this.
Now, let me ask you this. Do you compartmentalize your life and your thinking? Do you have a church world, church kind of thinking, your hope in Christ, your hope for what the church can be for the community, and then your legal side, your academic side, which you obviously master wonderfully? I'm very impressed. So how do you pull that together?
I think about them all in one. I think it's definitely a lifestyle. And so for me, I use biblical principles and biblical techniques in my own work to think about these ideas, because the ideas. So when anybody was getting a doctorate degree, whether it's in criminal justice, anthropology, sociology, psychology, they call those degrees the social sciences. And they call those degrees social sciences because people are trying to figure out social issues. And so, for example, I'm working on a project now that's dealing with juvenile lifers, individuals as children who committed murder and was sentenced to life without parole. And the Supreme Court recently said those individuals can release prison. So here we have individuals who have done harm, they have committed murder, but they have gotten a second chance at life in the communities. And there's a lot of conflicting views as to the families of murder victims, as to their lives. And I think the Bible is in biblical instruction and biblical teaching are so great to understand those words, because it could be very difficult as if I didn't have the godly wisdom to try to understand these particular difficult concepts. But through the theological studies, you start to understand these ideas of second chance, right? So David is, one of the greatest kings that we get in the Bible, but he was a murderer, and so I think with biblical process helps you to develop these different aspects of your life, understand that we are all human, and that we all make particular mistakes, and if we're going to solve these particular problems, it's going to take somebody with godly wisdom. I always think about the 3 Hebrew boys, how there was a problem that they were able to solve socially. I also think about Joseph. There was a problem. And so Joseph had godly wisdom, but he finds himself in a prison where he's doing secular interpretation of dreams, right? And so, but he's still thinking about these things. One, to solve a problem for Potiphar that he can't figure out. And so I believe that God is my prayer, that God would use me as a vessel to use his instructions and teaching to kind of and as I think as pastors to use our gifts and to use them for secular formats, not only for the kingdom building, but also to solve problems. And Joseph was revered in his land because not only was he able to lead. I think when you're thinking about leading people, it's not only about try to solve a problem, but you're trying to move people from their agenda into God's agenda.
Yes. Now, is part of your work both professionally and spiritually involved at all with keeping young people out of the system altogether, keeping them from going down that path? What are some of the keys? And especially what can churches do to stop the bodies from falling in the river in the first place?
So I think one of the things we have to do is, and so at Temple University, I run a program called the Urban Youth Leadership Academy program. And one of the areas that I study is called the school to prison pipeline. And in Philadelphia, we have a very interesting educational climate where the middle school that you attend actually will determine your life trajectory. And I say that in a serious sense where what we found out the research was, in Philadelphia, you have all different types of high schools. You have charter schools, you have special admission schools, you have private schools. And so for the high school I went to, take for example, had some very stringent qualifications. So in fifth grade, you had to be mentally gifted. You have to test in the highest percentage of your standardized tests. You had to play a musical instrument. And then on the day of your orientation, you had to audition and beat the other kids out for your particular instrument. And so what we found is that we had bright and talented youth in our city who may went to the neighborhood high school who were not offered the same opportunities. And so, for example, you may have a kid who goes to a neighborhood middle school, and one of the key qualifications to get into a school, let's say like Masterman, which is one of the top schools in the country, special admission school, in order to get Girls High, Central, schools that people know about, you had to have algebra in eighth grade. You have to have taken algebra. Most neighborhood schools do not offer algebra for eighth grade students. So there's already a litany of schools that they can apply to. And so they find themselves in lower performing high schools. Most of them dropout is readily, and college matriculation is very low. And so what we found is that a lot of kids to the school to prison pipeline weren't really getting key opportunities, and this was one way they were falling into the system. And so I think one thing that churches can do, and one thing we have been thinking critically about, is how do we get services and supports to children before they have been labeled. So all the kids we work with, they don't have chronic absenteeism, they're not at risk, but they're also not your high achievers. And I think what we can do as pastors and leaders and this is what I'm doing in my own church, we see youth who may have a lot of potential, but maybe a little rough around the edges, like, I was during that time. And it's important that we get them positive youth development, vacation Bible school, things that they can develop, leadership opportunities that they can have that will benefit them in high school and college. So I'll give a short example. One of the things in college, I became a McNair scholar. McNair is a Black astronaut who died in 1989 Challenger explosion, and he dedicated his life to a program to help first-generation college students and underrepresented groups to get access into a PhD. So straight from undergraduate, I went to college at 15. I finished college at the age at 19 and applied straight to a PhD program, and that was through the guidance of the McNair program. And what happened with McNair is you had to have done some type of leadership project so to show them that you could apply to the application. In my church that summer, we did something called Fun in the Sun, SON, where we did this youth gathering in the summertime. We had like cotton candy and games and music, and my pastor preached and I played and I organized it. I got the drill teams to come out. I got the Marine Corps to come out to the obstacle course, and it's something that I had organized. And I was able to use that experience in my church to say, I'm passionate about youth development, and this is something they were very impressed by that. So I think as pastors and leaders, we need to think strategically, especially for our youth, how are we getting them involved in leadership opportunities? And so I think one of the biggest things that I've benefited of, when I was 12 years old, they let me be the organist in the church. I wasn't that good. I'm good now. I'm better now. The organist in the church. I was a junior trustee at the church. I was a junior deacon. So I had these leadership abilities. So these were skills and things that I could have done as a youth. And I was able to leverage those things into the academic space. So when I came to academic space, I already could publicly speak because at a young age, I was forced to do it. At a young age, I understand budgets and money because I was a junior trustee, and understand that it takes 2 signatures if you want to deposit this amount of money in bank accounts and things like that. So I think we have to do a better job of getting that capital, that information capital, to some of our youth. And I don't think, and the Bible says, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they get old, they won't depart. And I think we have to think about getting that information to them as early as possible. Even though they may be young, they may not understand it yet, but it will be beneficial to their success moving forward.
Now, you and your brother have both chosen the criminal justice field. Different approaches to it, but you're both in the same general vicinity as far as career choices. Do you attribute any of that to your family of origin? What kind of family life did you have with that?
So it's a funny story behind that. So my grandfather was in the military, and he had a criminal justice background. He was a police officer for the VA. My dad was in the military, and he was a correctional officer. So we had that training growing up, but my mom worked for a human services agency called Resources for Human Development. So we kind of saw both sides. And my dad was kind of interesting because, sometimes people would come home from prison and they would live with us. And that would be very interesting because both of my parents are pastors. They were pastors. They were missionaries when I was younger. My dad traveled to Africa. So I had a very interesting sense of people and what people thought is criminal is human. So my brother, he decided to go and follow after my dad's footsteps, with the policing. And then, it was my chance to go to college. Yeah, it was my chance to go to college. And I didn't want to go to college. I didn't think I was college material. So I wanted to go. So my plan was to go into the military, and I was all set to go. And then the Iraq War happened, and my mom was like, no, buddy. She was like, you're going to college. You at least have to try it out. And so, I said, okay. So I asked my brother, what, about this criminal justice degree. And I found out that it was a bunch of electives and you only had to take one math course. So I said, it sounds pretty feasible. I'll do that. And it was the best decision I ever made. And it's been really, interesting. I think from it, growing up in the inner city, a lot of questions I had a lot of friends who passed away from gun violence, saw a lot of things in my community. And I really took the time to use criminal justice to understand those particular issues that were happening. And my heart, my passion is always, I think God has been so fortunate in my life with the anointing that I was able to avoid certain snares. And for the quote, but for the grace of God. And so it's been my passion to help other youth to avoid those pitfalls. Because when I'm a first generation college student, in my environment, my brother was the first person in our whole entire family. My grandmother had 4 children. It's about 28 grandchildren altogether. It was my first person in my entire family to go to college. And so when people said they were going to college, I thought that they were like Einstein or like you only had to go for brain surgery. I knew nothing about the college space. And so that's been my position. As God has blessed me, too much is given, much is required. I've been working in the community to show people that higher education, is an option. And so I always thought that you had to, I was an athlete. I thought you had to play football or be an entertainment to make it out your particular circumstances. And I didn't know that you could do that with education.
Wow. Let me ask you one thing. This might be a little sensitive, but one of the things we're struggling with as a country right now is systemic racism in the law enforcement environment. You're obviously on the side of law enforcement. It's a family business in some respects. But have you ever been on the wrong side of law enforcement based on your race? Have you ever experienced racism yourself on a personal basis in interaction with the police or with the legal system?
Yeah, I think, it's really interesting. And so before my brother became a police officer, I remember in college, he was the first person to go to college. My grandmother bought him a BMW. I'll never forget, it was midnight blue. It was a 328 XI. And we drove that thing everywhere. We were stopped like all the time, for no reason. And you kind of, as a Black man, you can never really articulate that feeling, when you're driving with music. Maybe you're doing a slightly above the speed average and you see those blue and red sirens to kind of get behind you. And so it's really interesting to have those feelings. And so I haven't had many experiences with law enforcement, but what's interesting is that I've dedicated my life to helping other individuals. So I spent a great majority of my time, almost 3-4 days a week at the Juvenile Detention Center. And then after I got done that work, since 2015 or 2016, I've actually been teaching and mentoring in the state prisons. And so to understand the conditions and what people were facing there kind of broke my heart. And that's when I really realized as a pastor and as a scholar that once an individual has contact with the system, it's very, very difficult, almost extremely possible in a sad way to get out of that circumstance because there's so many conditions. So for example, if you go to prison and then you come home, you might be on parole. I mean, you can be on parole for any minor infraction. You can go back to prison. It's different. It's stipulations on if you have a felony on record, where you can live, what job you can have, what professional license you can have. So it becomes very difficult to tackle that record. And so God has placed in my heart, we've always done prison ministry. And I think as pastors, the best thing that we can do to kind of combat institutional racism is give those individuals in our community and people who attend our church those second chances that they would not get maybe from those mainstream employers. And God, will lay on your heart who needs that opportunity, who needs that mentorship. And there's a lot of people we've helped who worked at the church. We've got their resumes and they've gone off to get really, really good jobs. But when they came home, people didn't give them a second chance because they were a little bit rough around the edges and they needed that extra care and concern. And so I think it's our job as pastors to nurture those individuals after they've had some, contact with the system and that they can take their wings and fly out.
Wow. Well, I'm really impressed by what you've achieved at such a young age and the direction. I mean, you could take your gifts and talents and go in any direction you wanted to, I'm sure, but you're giving back to the community. You're helping people who the rest of society would more easily turn their backs on, and you're doing it in the name of the Lord. You're doing it as part of God's call on your life. And that really gives me hope. I believe that we have hope. I think someone once said, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what is right with America. And I think that's true of the church as well. There's nothing wrong with the church that can't be fixed by what is right with the church. And when you have the church working in the community the way that God intends and people taking responsibility in the various areas of society as followers of Christ, there's real hope. So thank you for what you do. Really do appreciate it.
And thank you so much, Pastor Ed. I really appreciate your mentorship and guidance, even being at Victory Church, the way you've been helping us think about how we can have a greater impact in the community. And we really appreciate you and Pastor Jason for helping us troubleshoot. And you have a lot of years in ministry, and being as a young pastor, it's great to know that I can pick up the phone if I find myself under a jam or frustrated about something, that you can call and I can get prayer and I can get resources to really make the impact and change that we want to see.
Well, I hope you call me often. And again, looking forward to the time after the coronavirus lockdown is totally over and we're totally free to join together without any restrictions to get back together. We could have a lunch outside sometime soon, right?
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome.
That would be good. Well, thank you for your time. God bless you, and hopefully we'll reconnect again in a future date for another one of these sessions. Because I think there's a lot more you have to share.
Thank you for joining us for EdTalks. For more information about Victory Church, go to getvictory.net.